One of the skills that will serve a history student well, both on the end-of-course exams and in their everyday life outside of school, is the ability to recognize bias when they see it or hear it. Bias is a predisposition on a person's part to feel a certain way about a certain subject. Teenagers, for instance, might display a bias towards feeling positively about a fellow student's actions in any conflict with a teacher, due to a bias towards those of their own age. Almost everyone displays bias at some point, and recognizing it can be a useful tool for determining how accurate or trustworthy a particular source is. Your coursework has been designed with assessments called Approach the Bench. Read the instructions carefully, as always, as they provide some helpful tips. Then click Start. Approach the Bench assessments always follow the same pattern. These will provide you with a primary source document, usually a quote, from the relevant historical period. They will then ask you a multiple choice question, usually asking you to identify what the speaker is talking about. If you have trouble with this section, utilize the pluck, plug, and pick the possible strategy developed for Starfall quizzes, which you can find on the class Google site under the HAQ tab. A second multiple choice question will ask you to identify the tone of the primary source, positive, negative, or mixed. Use your answer from the first question to help you with this one. Ask yourself, is the speaker feeling positive or negative about blank, where you fill in the blank with the answer to the first question. Take this example. The primary source quotation says, "I believe brick and mortar schools are the only true way a student can be expected to learn and are far superior to the arm's length mentality of other avenues of education. Mr. Brown, principal at Rock Creek High." If we say that Mr. Brown is talking about the effectiveness of virtual schools, how does he feel about that subject? Positive, negative, or mixed? The answer is negative. He uses words like superior and displays a derogatory attitude towards virtual education by declaring that it has an arm's length mentality. The difficult parts of any Approach the Bench assessment, of course, are the final two short answer questions. The first asks you to identify the possible bias. What does this look like? Look at the quote and look at who provided it. Do either of them provide you with information needed to identify the bias? Ask yourself why you thought the quote was positive or negative, and answer that question here. A good template would be, I thought that writer displayed a positive bias by blank and was possibly influenced to think that way because blank. Look at our sample quote again. A good sentence to answer this question would be, I thought Mr. Brown displays a negative bias towards virtual schools by refusing to consider possible positive aspects of a virtual education and was possibly influenced to think that way because he is an administrator in a brick and mortar traditional school. We identified the negative bias again. We pointed out that the bias displayed itself by refusal to consider positive points of a virtual education, and we used our knowledge of the source of the quote to identify possible reasons for the bias. In this case, because the speaker was a principal at a traditional school. The next and final question asks you to develop a possible counterargument to the displayed bias. Many times this will simply expand upon your opening phrase from the previous question. In the case of our sample, we would point out that the increasing numbers of virtual school students seems to point out that brick and mortar schools are not the only true way students can be expected to learn, and that colleges and universities are using the virtual model more and more to impart higher levels of education to students. I hope this video has helped you develop a plan for tackling those Approach the Bench assessments and identifying bias in your history work.